Okay, so this next study is very, very simple. It's called The Great Controversy, and of course the purpose is to show that there is a cosmic conflict between Christ and Satan, and that planet Earth is a theater for that conflict. Okay? There is a cosmic conflict between Christ and Satan, and that planet Earth is the theater for that conflict. Okay? And again, our study today has three parts. We have the origin of evil, okay? We have the outworking of evil, and we have the end of evil. Okay? Origin of evil, the outworking of evil, and the end of evil. And there's two key elements that are going to come up and again. And those two elements are, number one, it involves around the word responsibility, right? And the other one is God's character of love. Okay? Responsibility and God's character of love. So let's just turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. And I'm going to try to do this as quick as possible to see if we could finish on time. Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. And you might just want to let them know, if you've ever had a question as to, people always ask, if God is so good and He's so loving, why is the world so bad? This study will answer that question. This study is kind of like the vindication of God's character. Okay? So this is kind of like the study to answer, what if God is so good, why is the world so bad? Make sense? It's pretty simple. Okay, so these are the good texts. Genesis chapter 1. And let's see how God created the world to begin with. Okay? So you start, in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, etc., etc. Let's jump down to verse 4 for sake of time. And God saw the light that it was what? Good. Okay? Now, if you're in the habit of, marking your Bibles, you might just want to circle all the words with good in them. So those would be verses 4, verse 10, verse 12, verse 18, verse 21, verse 25, and verse 31. So here we see that, verse 10, and God called the dry land earth, and gathering together the waters He called seas, and God saw that it was good. Verse 12, God saw that it was good. 18, God saw that it was good, that it was good, that it was good. And verse 31, and God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. Okay, so here we see that when God creates something, He creates it how? Good. It was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. So when God creates something, when He forms something, we notice here that God creates it good, and not just good, but very good. Now, there are many words to describe the world in which we live in today, but good would probably not be at the top of that list, right? Because there's too much genocide, there's too much war, there's too much corruption in government, right? There's too much murders, there's too much suicide, there's too much ugliness in the world today to call the world that we live in good, right? Make sense? Okay, so the question is, or the point is, this is how God created it before sin, came in, okay? So let's go from the first book of the Old Testament to the first book of the New Testament, which is in Matthew. Matthew chapter 13. And here we find a marvelous parable. The parable of the wheat and the tares, okay? The parable of the wheat and the tares. Okay. And let's just go through the parable real quick. So here Jesus draws our attention that the seed that He sowed was good. And there's four goods. It's in verse 24, 27, 37 and 38. Okay? So four times he calls to our attention that the seed that He sowed was good seed. Okay? It's the very same word, this very same idea that we find in Genesis chapter 1. Make sense? Okay. Now, if you're going to boil this parable down to a single phrase, right? There is a 5-word phrase in this parable that really gives us the essence as to what this parable is. See if you could try to locate that. A 5-word phrase to let us know what this parable really is all about. Can anyone find that? Yeah, an enemy has done this, right? That really kind of crystallizes what this parable is all about. Now, let me ask you a question. How much responsibility did the planter of the field take for the appearance of weeds, or of tares, I should say? How much responsibility did the planter, right, take as to the appearance of tares? How much, according to the parable, how much responsibility did he take? None, right? He blames it on who?
On the
Yeah, I'm sorry, what? Yeah, he says an enemy has done this. Does that make sense? So here's our first text that really highlights this idea of responsibility. Does that make sense? Now, let's look at a story which is in the next book, Luke chapter 13, which we see this principle being played out of an enemy, okay? Which is in Luke. So we go from Matthew chapter 13 to Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13. And remember, we're kind of like discussing the origin of evil. Luke chapter 13. If I could find it. And verses 10 through 16. And here we have this wonderful account of a story of Jesus healing a woman that is infirmed or sick. Okay? So who wants to read Luke chapter 13 verses 10 through 16 real quickly? Okay, go ahead.
And when he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could not in no wise lift up herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him, and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. The Lord then answered him and said, Thou hypocrite, do not each one of you on the Sabbath day loose his ox or his ass from the stall, and lead him away to watering? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?
Okay, very good. Now again, in this parable, like the parable before, there is a 4-word phrase as to what this parable is all about. See if you can locate that. There is a 4-word phrase. Yeah, whom Satan has bound, right? Now, let me ask you a question. How much responsibility, there it is again, and remember, those are well, it's not up on the board, but one of our 2 elements. How much responsibility did Jesus take for the woman's infirmed or degenerative condition? None. But how much responsibility does he take for the woman's, healing? How much? All of it. Yeah, exactly, all of it. He takes full responsibility, right, for her regenerated condition. Now notice this in verse 16. Look at verse 16. Like she said, it says that this woman was like that because who bound her? Satan. Okay, let me just introduce, and you want to introduce to your Bible study this term, Satan. And this term, Satan, comes from, it's a transliteration. Do you guys know what a transliteration is? A transliteration is very simple. It comes from the Hebrew word Satan. I believe that's how it's spelled. And what a transliteration is, they take one word that you know, with that language's letters, and try to convert it to another language with the same type of letters. Does that make sense? That's a transliteration. So we have this, you know, Jesus uses this term Satan or Satan, and what that word means is enemy or adversary, right? Enemy or adversary. That's what the word Satan actually means. Do you guys remember in the parable that we just came from? Jesus said, who did this? An enemy. So that kind of like correlates with the term Satan. It means enemy or adversary. Okay? Now, that raises the question, who is this Satan and where did he come from? And that is our transition question from this to the next verse, which is in Luke chapter 10. Who is this Satan? And we have two clues in Luke chapter 10. We have two clues here in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. But just to give the context, just look at verse 17 real quick and verse 20, and I'll go ahead and read that. And, you know, just to help, you know, your studies with the context, you just let them know, hey, Jesus at this time sent his disciples, his 70 disciples, and they're coming back and they're happy. It's like, Jesus, you won't believe this. Even the demons are subject unto us in your name, right? And look at verse 17. And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through your name. And Jesus says, hey guys, don't be happy because of this. Don't be happy that, you know, essentially the demons are out and you're in. In verse 20, he says, notwithstanding this, rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. Why do you think that is? You got to remember, Jesus would have known all these demons or fallen angels by name, right? And, you know, he wasn't happy that they're out. So he says it, don't be happy that these guys are out. Be happy that your names are written in heaven. Be happy that you're in. Rejoice in that. Make sense? So that's the context. But look at verse 18. In verse 18, we get two clues as to where Satan came from. So there's two things here, okay? Number one, that Satan fell. And number two, that he fell from where?
Heaven.
Heaven, right? Okay. So this is the, let's just say the walk trip illustration, okay? Okay, so let's just say that Doris and I are walking along, you know, on the sidewalk, and because Doris is a little mischievous, she trips me, right, and I fall. Whose fault would that be? Yeah, that would be hers, right? But let's just say now I'm walking alone by myself and I fall. Whose fault would that be? Mine, right? So the insinuation, look at the verse again, verse 18. And he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. The insinuation here is that the responsibility of Satan's fall was his own. Do you guys see that? So that's the insinuation here, that the responsibility as to why Satan fell was his own. Okay? Make sense? And then, of course, the second point here is that he came from heaven. Does that make sense? So the question is, this is the transition question, how did that happen? How did Satan fall from heaven? And our next two verses are going to answer that question. Let's go to Ezekiel. So let's turn your Bibles to Ezekiel with me. Ezekiel chapter 28. And here we're going to be reading verses 11 through 15 and 17 and 18. God, through the prophet Ezekiel, starts talking about the king of Tyre, or Tyrus. Okay? But God's concern is not with the king of Tyre himself. God's concern is with the power behind the king of Tyrus. Right? So, for example, Hitler, because you know the king of Tyre was an evil man. So, for example, Hitler was an evil man, right? We agree on that. But was Hitler the originator of evil? No, right? So here, kind of, God pulls back the curtain, so to speak, and he kind of like reveals who is the power behind all evil men. Okay, so let's just quickly start in verse 11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You have been in Eden, the garden of God. Now, was the king of Tyre in Eden? No, but there was an evil power who was in Eden, right? Continuing on. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The sardis, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold, the workmanship of thy tabrets, and the pipes was prepared in thee in the day that you were created. Verse 14, you were the anointed cherub that covers. I have set you so. You were upon the holy mountain of God. You walked up and down in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. Let me ask you a question just from these verses alone. What three words are repeated in these verses? What three words? And if you have the King James, it's actually two, but there's a phrase that kind of like means the same thing.
Perfection? Perfect?
Yeah, perfect. Right? So there you have, if you have the King James at the end, it says,
Anointed.
Thou sealest up the sum. That's the same thing as essentially you were perfect. And in verse, and the other two are in verse, well, at the end of it, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And then in verse 15. Do you guys see that? Okay. So here we see that this angel or this being, he was created how? How was he created? Perfect. Do you guys see that? He was, and you know, there's a reason God said it 3 times. He wants to let us know that when God creates something, he creates it how? He creates it perfect, right? Okay, makes sense. Okay. So the question is, how did this happen? Well, let's just look at verse 18 and 19 real quick. And just, I'm going to ask the question and then I'm going to read the verses. Where does the responsibility lie? And look at verse 17 and 18. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You have corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness. I will cast you to the ground. I will lay you before kings, that they may behold you. You have defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities. So notice the responsibility. It's thine, thy, thou, thy, thou, and thine. Like 7 times, God says, hey, it's your responsibility, it's your responsibility, it's your responsibility. Do you see that? Make sense? Okay. There's a couple of things real quick in verses 14 and 15 that I just want to bring to your attention. Let's just start in verse 14. Do you see there where it says, you were the anointed cherub that covers? Do you guys see that? Okay. You want to let them know that this is sanctuary language, right? So you just let them know real quick and tell them, hey, we're going to have a study on this concept or this idea called the sanctuary. But for you to understand what Ezekiel here is talking about, I just need to give you a really quick understanding as to what the sanctuary was, okay? So here we have the sanctuary, right? And you know, there's 3 compartments. You have the outer courts, you have the holy place, and you have the most holy place. And then, what's in the most holy place? You have the Ark of the Covenant, right? And you just explain, hey, and I'm sure, you know, I'm sure you guys have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, or I'm sure they've heard the term Ark of the Covenant before, but if not, you just explain it to them. It's like, hey, listen, the Ark was simply a box, right? It was a box that contained what? The 10 Commandments, right? And on top of that box was a lid, and it was called what?
Mercy.
The mercy seat, and essentially that represented the throne of God, okay? And you see that light right there? That's kind of like the representation of God, okay? But what's interesting about the ark is on top of the mercy seat, you have these two carved angels, and they essentially were covering the light. Thus, they are called the covering, or they're called cherubims. But according to the verse in verse 14, it says, "You were the anointed cherub that covers." So people that Ezekiel was writing to would have known immediately that he was talking about these two carved angels that, on top of the mercy seat. Does that make sense? So essentially what God is trying to tell us here is that this angel, when he fell, right, this perfect angel, when he had his fall, this happened when he was in the immediate presence of God. Okay, he was one of the closest angels to God in heaven when he fell. Does that make sense? You guys follow? So just very quickly, just kind of like give him a brief description of that. Okay, notice the very next phrase in verse 14. You were upon the holy mountain of God. Okay, let's just stop right there. Okay, when God reveals himself, he usually does it in a mountain. And let's just think about this. In Mount Moriah, what happened? Abraham offered up Isaac, right? In Mount Sinai, he revealed the law, right? I'm sorry, what? To Moses, very good. In Mount Carmel, he revealed his power by, throwing fire down and consuming the offering, right? On Calvary, that's where he died. And on the Mount of Olives, that's where Jesus preached. So usually where God is essentially in the mountain. That kind of like represents where he is. So when it says there that you were upon the holy mountain of God, this is another phrase that is just indicating to us that you were in the very presence of God. And the last phrase indicates the exact same thing, that you walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. And I'm not sure if you have this in your study there, in your outline, but is Revelation 15 verse 2, is that next to these verses in Ezekiel on your study? Okay, just note down real quick, Revelation 15 verse 2, and there you have, the people of God on the sea of glass surrounding God. Okay? And essentially, when you have a sea of glass and you have, I believe the phrase that is in Revelation 15:2, it says, sea of glass mingled with fire. Okay, that's what it says. Sea of glass mingled with fire. What is that? What do you think that would look like? Essentially, that would look like essentially, in the midst of fiery stones or stones and fire. Okay, does that make sense? So in other words, what God here is trying to say is that when you fell, you were in the immediate presence of God, and He gives us three phrases to let us know that. Make sense? Last but not least, you just want to point out very quickly again in verse 15 that you were perfect, that when God created him, he was perfect in his ways from the day you were created until what? Iniquity. Now, people are not going to know what iniquity means, so you just use the word evil, okay? Most people that are not, biblically literate aren't going to understand what iniquity means, so you just let them know that means evil, okay? So the question is, how did this happen? And that's our transition question. Let's go to Isaiah 14 real quick. Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah 14. And verses 12, I believe, through 14. And we're asking the question, how did this happen? I'm just looking at the time. How did this happen? And what's the very first word in verse 12 of Isaiah 14? Yeah, how, right? How have you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? So we ask the question, how does a perfect being, which God created him perfect, how does a perfect angel in a perfect environment created by a perfect God, how does he become the originator of evil? right? Because people are going to ask, and we're saying, hey, that is a legitimate question. But guess what? Even a prophet of God asked the very same thing. How did this happen? Right? And that's what he says. How are you fallen from heaven, or Lucifer? Now notice what else he says there in verse 12. How are you fallen from heaven? Where else did we read those two words from? We read that in Luke chapter 18. I beheld Satan fall from heaven. And here's a tie-in. How have you fallen from heaven? Do you see that? Make sense? Okay, so what you want to bring out here is very simply that when Isaiah brings out the word how did this happen? What you want to explain to them is that there is a mystery as to the origins of evil. Like, how would this happen? Well, guess what? That's a great question. But guess what? Isaiah had the same type of question. Okay? So there's, and the Bible even says this. It calls it the mystery of evil. Now, it doesn't say evil. It says the mystery of iniquity, right? And that's in Thessalonians. Okay? So in verse 13, we get we don't know everything, but in verse 13, we get a little glimpse as to what exactly happened. And it says, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the height of the most of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So Satan had what type of problem?
Right.
Yeah, or I like to say he had an I problem, right? It was all about himself, an I problem. Yeah, selfishness. So it's an easy way to remember that is the center letter of the word sin is I, and so too with pride. Make sense? Okay, so what exactly from verses 13 and 14 did Satan want exactly?
He wants to be like the Most
Yeah,
High.
yeah, he wanted to sit essentially in his throne. And real quickly, we probably won't do this real quick, but it's very easy. There's actually, I believe, 11 references to upward motion. So for example, in verse 13 it says, you have said in your heart that I will ascend 1 into heaven 2, that's heaven's up. I will exalt my throne 3, above 4, the stars, that's 5, stars are up. I will also sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, that's 7. I will ascend 8, above the heights 9, above the clouds 10. I will be like the Most High 11. Okay, so Satan wanted to go up, he wanted to go up, and he wanted to go up. And if you have time, you could go to Philippians chapter 2, and you can see the contrast between Satan and God. Satan wanted to go up, and Jesus wanted to go down for us. And notice in verse 15 what his upward, desire, brings him to. It says, "You shall be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." So this is something that you want to bring out real quickly. Satan's desire was that he wanted essentially worship. Okay, Satan's desire is that he wanted worship and honor that was due only to God. Make sense? Okay. So real quickly, we're going to look at, or just go over 2 quick illustrations. And the first illustration is called the love gun illustration. And the second one is the Ted Bundy / Jeffrey Dahmer illustration, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so very quickly, if someone came into the room, right, into this room right now, and he had a gun, and he pointed the gun right at you, and he says, what would you do? You would stand up, no doubt. And if he told you, hey, listen, line up single file next to the door, what would you do? You would line up single file, right? And he said, hey, let's all go to the sidewalk. We would all go. And then if he said, start barking like a dog, we would most likely start barking like a dog, right? And he's pointing a gun right at you, right? But then if he said, hey, listen, now, and he's pointing a gun right at you, now what I want you to do is I want you to love me with all of your heart. Could you do that? Could you do that? No. Why? Exactly, because because love cannot be forced. Okay, love cannot be forced. So what you wanted to tell them as far as this, because people ask the question, how did this happen? I like to say, when people ask that, essentially is we have a word for forced intimacy, and we call that word what? Rape. God is not a divine rapist. Okay? God is not a divine rapist. Does that make sense? Okay. So when God created Satan, he took the same risk as to when he created you and me. Meaning, when God creates a being with free will, he has to allow that being, in this case Satan, whether or not to choose to love him or not to. And Satan chose not to love him, and God honored that choice. Another real quick point is this. You just wanted to let and explain to them that God did not create Satan. Okay? It's kind of like this, and this is the Ted Bundy / Jeffrey Dahmer illustration. No one in their right mind would ask, what type of a mother gave birth to a Ted Bundy or by the way, we all know who Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer are. They were serial killers here in the U.S. Okay, so no one would say, what kind of mother did this, right? She didn't. The mother gave birth to a beautiful little baby, and that baby, through his own choices, became the Ted Bundy or the Jeffrey Dahmer that we know today. So too with Satan. God did not create Satan. God created Lucifer, a perfect holy being, like we already saw. But Lucifer, through his own choices, created the Satan that we know today. So this is essentially the origin of evil. Now we're going to go to the outworking of evil. And you just want to let them know, by the way, this doesn't answer all the questions as to the origin of evil, right? Even Isaiah had, how did this happen? There's you need to reiterate to them, because we don't know how this exactly happened. How does a perfect angel, a perfect environment created by a perfect God, how did he become evil? We don't have a really good answer. We have a clue as to by his own choices, and you just let them know that this doesn't answer all the questions, but it answers the most important ones. Make sense? Okay, so now we go from the origin of evil to the outworking of evil, okay? And which is a really important part, and essentially, you just want to kind of, transition with this question. If Satan walked into this room right now, and you knew it was Satan, right? Let's say, hey, I'm Satan, and he says, worship me, would you do that? Do you think he knows that? Yeah, he's not stupid, right? So how is Satan going to get what he desires but does not deserve? Through deceit, right? And that's our next verse. Let's turn to 2 Thessalonians. That's right after Colossians in the New Testament. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 4. And I'll read this very quick. Are you guys there? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And it says this: Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him, that you be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as that day of Christ is at hand. Now notice verse 3. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. And you just want to let them know that those two phrases, man of sin and son of perdition, that is the Antichrist. Okay? And you just say, hey, listen, we're going to have a whole study on this character, but we're just trying to get the idea as to the outworking of evil. We're going to have a whole study on this in the future, okay? Continuing in verse 4, now notice verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. What does that sound like? Or who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Satan. Now notice, continuing on, above that, all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, very quickly, you just want to make the point that this is a religious figure. And why do we say he's a religious figure, and why do we justify ourselves in saying that he's a religious figure? Because notice verse 4 again. It says, who opposes and exalts, etc., so that he, as God, sits in a temple of God. So we have this religious figure who's essentially trying to be God, right? And essentially he wants worship, because that's essentially what it says there. Make sense? Now let's go to Revelation 13 and see this principle being played out. Revelation 13, and we're going to see very quickly this principle being played out. And this is really the climax. This and the next 3 verses are really the climax of your study. And it's going to be Revelation 13, verses 1 through 4. But especially verse 4, and you're going to bring it in with chapter 12, verse 9 as well. So I'll just go ahead and read it. Verse 1, and I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw the beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And you just let them know very quickly, do not get caught up in the imagery. We'll talk about that in a future lesson, but right now just try to get the main point, okay? Verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of the bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, seat, and great authority. Okay, now we have here a strange amalgamated beast, and then we have this dragon. Look at chapter 12, verse 9, and tell me who this dragon is. Yeah, so according to Revelation chapter 12, the chapter right before it, it tells us that this dragon is Satan, right? Now notice at the end of verse 2, it says something very interesting. It says, Satan gives this beast his power, his seat, and great authority. And we ask the question, why would Satan do that? Isn't that exactly what he wanted in Isaiah? Didn't he want authority and power and essentially to be worshipped? Well, the next verse gives us an answer. The next 2 verses, I should say. And I saw one of his heads as they were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And notice this, and all the world wondered after the beast, verse 4, and they worshipped the dragon. Now, who's the dragon again? So, who is worshiping Satan? In context with verse 3?
The world.
The world. So, does the Bible tell us that the world is going to worship Satan? Yes, right? But the question is, how does he do it? Now, this is the really cool part. And they worship Satan, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? This is what I like to call the switcheroo. Okay? The switcheroo. I'm just looking at the time. The switcheroo. And essentially, it's very simple. Satan gives who power, his seat, and great authority? The beast. And verse 3, it says that the whole world wondered after the beast, and that they worship the dragon, which gives power to the beast. So it's very, very simple. So just think about this as the beast, this hand as a beast, and this hand as Satan, or the dragon. So Satan gives this beast his power, seat, and great authority. Right? So when people worship the beast, they essentially end up worshiping who? The power that gave that power its seat. So it's worship through representation. Does that make sense? Worship through representation. Because Satan gives power, seat, great authority, when they worship this beast, they essentially worship the power that gave him the power, his seat and great authority. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Very, very simple. And you just let them know, hey, the central issue in the end times has to do with the issue of worship. So notice with me in chapter 13 and 14, and again, you might just want to circle these words. The word worship occurs 8 times in Revelation 13 and 14. And we saw the first one there in verse 3. The next one is in verse, well, the next one, it's in verse 4. There's 2 times in verse 4. The next one, it says, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Verse 12, and he causes all the power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast. Verse 15, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship. Chapter 14 and verse 7, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of the judgment is come. Worship him that made heaven. Verse 9, again worship, and verse 12, worship. So 8 times the Bible tells us that the issue at the end of time has to do with worship, worship, worship. So this great conflict between Christ and Satan, it centers around essentially worship. Okay? And nowhere is this more evident than in our next verse, and that's your transition, which is found in Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, what we find here is the 3 temptations of Christ from Satan. And the last temptation, Satan really goes all out and he shows his true colors. Okay? Let's just read verse 9 of Matthew chapter 4. And it says this. And he said unto him, this is Satan talking to Jesus, all these things will I give you if you fall down and what?
Worship.
And worship. So really we see what Satan really wants, right? This is the height of insanity of Satan. Here you have the creature asking the creator to bow down and worship him. Now, this is the fish bowl illustration, okay? So essentially what Satan is doing to Jesus is something similar to this. Let's suppose that you had a bowl and you had a goldfish in there. What Satan is asking Jesus is the equivalent of saying, let's say that fish could talk, and he says, Louis, bow down and worship me. In which I might respond, worship you, I'm going to eat you, right? So when you see Jesus, his response, he says, then said Jesus, get thee hence, Satan. Jesus can't even believe that Satan would actually ask him to worship him. So here we have the creature asking the creator to worship him. Make sense? Any questions on that? Pretty clear? Okay, so we go from the out. So this is essentially what Satan wants, worship. So we go from the outworking of evil to the end of evil, and it's very simple. What are the first 2 chapters of the Bible? The first 2 chapters of the Bible, it's not a trick question. Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? And what are the last 2 chapters of the Bible? 21 and 22. Okay, well we find in Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22 is the exact same thing. We find a perfect God with a perfect people in a perfect world with face-to-face communion essentially with God, okay? When you go in one chapter from Genesis, Genesis 1 and 2, you end up in Genesis chapter 3, right? And there, essentially, we find the first conflict between Christ and Satan, okay? And when you go in one chapter this way, from Revelation 21 and 22, you end up in Revelation 20, and there you have the last battle between Christ and Satan. And essentially, those are like 2 bookends, and everything in between is God trying to bring back what was lost in Eden. And what was lost in Eden? Face-to-face communion with God, a face-to-face relationship with God. That's what we lost, and God is going to restore that in Eden restored. And this is called the Eden to Eden perspective.